Hello, my friend, and welcome to our Tea Time. Today's Tea Time topic is a word I have made up. I call it unisolate. And yes, this is basically the opposite of isolation. And I've been thinking about isolation lately, mostly because I've gone through a difficult time personally with these last transits we've gone through. And I noticed that I have this tendency to isolate myself when I'm hurting most. In fact, I've noticed this through the years and noticed it with my clients who are also light walkers or light workers. Quite often, it's us people who give and love the most that tend to isolate ourselves when we are hurting. We're also the least likely to reach out and ask for help. And I've known this and I've observed this, but I'm really starting to feel this in this latest cycle. What's interesting is isolationism actually is a term that we really refer to on a political perspective. For instance, after World War I, the United States went into isolationism and did not want to get involved with Europe whatsoever. And that's why it took so long for us to enter into the war with FDR. The United States had become isolated from the rest of the world. And this idea of isolation is really something I think the ego does for us. In fact, the truth of our nature is everything in the universe is connected. There is no such thing as isolation. When we're in heaven, there is absolutely no privacy. Every thought you have ever had, everything you have ever done is public knowledge to everyone in the universe on the other side. There is no such thing as privacy or isolation in the spiritual world. And there really is no such thing as isolation in the material world because of electrons and protons and neutrons. You could have an electron from a rock end up beginning to orbit an electron in a leaf of on a plant. So there's no isolationism even with solid objects. In fact, it's our ego that tends to isolate. In fact, I believe that's what God invented the ego for. He invented this consciousness that has an ability to turn its back on God or turn its back on others, or a part of our consciousness that has the ability to isolate. And what's interesting is, if you observe human history over the last 2,000 years, we have become more and more isolated over time. And now with technology, that's even increasing faster. In the very beginning, we were not isolated at all. We lived in tribes. We had little teepees or little huts, and just a few feet over, we had another family or another couple with teepee and a hut. And if someone was crying in the village, everybody heard that that person was crying. Everyone saw that that person was crying and recognized it. There was no hiding our emotions, and as a result, we are very well cared for by one another. It could be a stranger, well, it was never a stranger if it was a tribe, but it could be a grandmother, a child. Anyone in the village might have felt called to the task of helping that other person. But then as we started to have organized religion, and more importantly, we had men who wanted absolute power, this push towards isolationism began to really take off. We moved from very connected tribes to isolated families in homes. And these homes, of course, isolated themselves off from other families. And then we began to isolate within the family, where we only care about just our family and not so much about the family who's just across the street. And now in the last 30 years, we've isolated even further because the average family has broken apart, so people don't have a team-based system to support them anymore. They have, quote, broken families. And so the families have now isolated into separate parts. And now that we have iPhones and personal devices, we're even further isolated in our minds. People tell me, the kids these days, they're actually talking more than they ever did by text messaging and calling. It may look like they're not connecting, but they really are connecting. I disagree. I believe they are isolated. Basically, a phone and reading a text message is very much like reading something from the author of a book. It's your mind that's imagining this. You're not feeling their vibration. You're not smelling their breath. You're not seeing their eyes love you. It's very, very isolated. So I've come to realize if we're going to move into this age of Aquarius, we got to quit being so damn private and isolated. In fact, I argue it's time to unisolate ourselves. Now, I actually did try this, okay, as I was going through some hard times and have been trying this. I basically felt very isolated and very alone, even though I know I wasn't. And what's funny is, for several days in a row, when things were at their worst, I literally was praying to God, please help me, please help me. I need help through this particular energy and sorrow. And do you know what God did? Basically, friends from out of the woodwork reached out to me out of nowhere. A friend invited me out to dinner one night. One friend happened to be in town. One friend who I haven't heard of from ever was just like, hey, how you been? How are things going? And so the more I prayed, the more God sent in people who cared about me and reached out. Now, what did my heart want to do? It actually wanted to isolate. Like when they reached out at first, I was like, oh, this is a chore. I don't feel like it. I'm sad. I can't be there for them. I blah, 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 my mind and my ego. And the irony is that even when when people were coming to help me and coming to come to my aid, I still had in my ego some sort of programming that I should remain isolated and handle this on my own. Now, as I said here in the beginning of this segment, it's my belief that there is absolutely zero isolation in heaven. There is zero separation between you and me. And I believe that if we're to become an evolved species, we have got to quit coming from this perspective of isolationism. We've got to quit thinking that the person across the street is any different than me, or even thinking that the tree that's been alive for 150 years is not as valuable as me. We need to unisolate our consciousness because it is my belief that is not the nature of how we be. Well, friends, I am so grateful that you've tuned in for this little show. I'll be back in 24 hours with more. If you feel isolated, I do have a service that has a loving community that was always coming to my aid and will come to your aid because we are a village and a tribe of love. It's called SeriousJoy.com. Give it a serious try here in the retrograde, and I will help you to unisolate your fraction parts too. Have a wonderful day. Remember, I love you, and to live, love, be. Live, love.